What does James Comey think of the future of justice in America? Joe Klein will join us to talk about Comey's new book, Saving Justice. How is the subject of parenthood handled in Peter Ho Davies' new novel? Elizabeth Egan will be here to talk about this month's group text selection, A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself. Alexandra Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast for the New York Times. It's January 15th. I'm Pamela Paul. Joe Klein joins us now to talk about a new book from James Comey. It's called Saving Justice, Truth, Transparency, and Trust. Joe, thanks for being here.
It's good to be with you, Pamela.
All right, Joe, you don't need any introduction, but for those who are not familiar with Joe, he is a former writer for The New Yorker, former columnist for Time magazine, author of many, many books, including perhaps most famously one that did not appear with his byline, Primary Colors, and a follow-up novel, Running Mate. And this week he reviews for us James Comey's second book. So the obvious question I have to ask first is, how does this book differ from his previous book?
Well, it doesn't differ very much at all, actually, except for one thing. He rehearses all of the confrontations he had with Donald Trump in both books. But in the second book, he places that in the context of the need for truth and transparency in government, which I think is a valuable thing. The book is a repetition of the first book, but it's not an insignificant repetition because of the context that he's now placed it in.
So the first book, A Higher Loyalty, was a kind of hybrid memoir, both from his earlier days as a prosecutor in the Department of Justice and then of his brief period at the DOJ under Trump. But it was also a kind of manifesto about justice. It feels like on the surface, this new book, Saving Justice, is kind of exactly the same thing.
Well, yeah, it is. It is the same thing. And it's obviously something that Comey feels very strongly about. But I think, the important thing here is his view of justice and his view of the FBI. Remember, he was the FBI director whom Trump fired because he allowed the Russia investigation to continue, which resulted, after he was fired, in the hiring of Bob Mueller as a special investigator. But Comey has a very distinctive view of justice, and it's ecclesiastical. He sees the members of the Justice Department all the way down to assistant DAs out in the country as being part of a sacred priesthood, sworn to absolute honesty, to complete probity, to conducting the business in an entirely fact-based and nonpartisan manner. And you can see how that might conflict with Donald Trump.
Right. Does he talk about what's happened at the Department of Justice since his departure?
He doesn't talk about that all that much, except to say that it has been corrupted by Trump. Trump spent the last 4 years trying to make it into a partisan weapon to go after his enemies. And Comey is appalled by that.
One of the things that you do in your review is draw the distinctions between Trump's view of justice and Comey's point of view. Is that something that Comey himself does in the book, or was that you?
He does it to a certain extent, but I teased it out a little bit. For me, the most important thing that has kind of gone overlooked about Trump, if anything can be said to have been overlooked, is his view of the world, which came out in the second debate with Joe Biden, where he said only low IQ refugees showed up for their refugee hearings. In other words, the smart ones absconded. Only stupid people abide by the laws. Smart people get around it. Only stupid people pay off their creditors. Smart people stiff them. And that is Donald Trump's operating philosophy. And unfortunately, it seems to be the operating philosophy of a lot of his followers. And that stands in direct contravention of Comey's operating philosophy, which is you got to tell the truth.
I don't think you could find two more temperamentally opposite people, Trump and Comey. But what's interesting, at least in the little bit of this book that I've read, it seems, is a slight shift in tone from the last book. I mean, in part, it seems like he is trying to draw a contrast. He opens up the book with Donald Trump sort of leaning back in his chair and telling him that Putin showed off to him, apparently, about Russia having the best prostitutes in the world. And he's telling this to James Comey.
Yeah, that would not go over very well. Comey is a religious Catholic, and as I said, he's religious about the notion of justice and truth. I mean, he tells a story about his early days as a U.S. district attorney, where he was working a drug case, and he had a government informant named Vinny. And it turned out that they put Vinny in the witness protection program, and Vinny took the opportunity to get married. The problem is that he was also married in his former life, which meant he was now a bigamist, which is a crime. And Comey says that it was his absolute responsibility, even though the bigamy had nothing to do with the drug case in question, to tell the other side, the defendant's lawyers, that Vinny was a bigamist. And that shows you the degree to which Comey will go in the defense of the truth, almost to the point of myopia.
I mean, not just the defense of the truth, but almost just a very much by the book following of the rules. So I'm assuming did he tell this in the context of trying to, again, defend his acts around Hillary's emails just prior to the 2016 election?
No, he tells the Vinny anecdote in the context of his confrontation with Trump. The Hillary thing is very interesting because he continues to defend his actions. And he criticizes Mueller, oddly, for not putting the entire report in context and in a language that the American people could understand. But Comey himself was guilty of the same thing in the Hillary Clinton case. You remember, he absolved her in June of 2016, and then he reopened the case in October because another cache of emails had been found on one of her aides' computers. And he could have said at that point, look, we've been through thousands and thousands and thousands of Hillary Clinton emails, and we haven't found anything untoward. It was sloppy for her to have the account, but she hasn't breached any confidences. And he could have gone on to say, I suspect that that'll be the same in this new tranche of emails that we've found, but we have to go through them anyway. And by not putting into context like that, all of a sudden, within a week of the election in 2016, the public got a sense that, oh yeah, maybe there is something wrong here after all. It gave a lot of fuel to the lock her up fire. In that case, I would say that Comey didn't abide by the rules that he now would like to have justice abide by, which is total transparency, and transparency includes context.
It sounds like this then is not an act of atonement, this book, but more of a sort of continued defensive act.
It is certainly not an act of atonement because he doesn't think he did anything wrong. But it's almost moving to see him standing up for this principle and actually believing that if Mueller had abided by this principle, it would have made any difference. Because Comey exists, we all exist, in an atmosphere now that has become just a sludge tide of cynicism and disinformation. It's really hard to push back against that. And that's why this book is really important right now. As we leave the Trump era, one hopes forever, we have to figure out how to reestablish a basic adherence to truth. My mentor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, famously said that everyone's entitled to his or her own opinion, but not his or her own facts. And we have gotten to a point where there are dueling sets of facts. And we've also gotten to the point where cynicism has become the coin of the realm. That's something that I saw happen during my 50 years as a journalist. When I started off, skepticism was the appropriate posture for a journalist, which meant you didn't take what politicians told you as the gospel. You questioned them closely, you doubted them, and you had them prove themselves to you. By the 1990s, by the time we had all of these cable channels in play, cynicism became the default position. it was really hard for a journalist, especially a beginning journalist, to write a positive piece about a politician. All politicians were assumed corrupt. Politics itself was the devil's work. I have this aphorism, which is that cynicism is what passes for insight among the mediocre. It's just too easy to be cynical all the time. And Donald Trump came out of that atmosphere. And we have to figure out a way to restore the prior atmosphere where truth was worshiped. And Comey, even though he isn't apologetic in this book, he's on the side of the angels because he believes that it can be no replacement for fact-based truth.
I'm going to restrain myself from having a full side conversation about Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I want to go back to Robert Mueller. Explain for listeners who might not recall what the relationship was between James Comey and Robert Mueller. And I'm curious then how open Comey is about his characterization and criticism of Mueller in the book.
Well, as with almost everybody else in the Justice Department, Comey worshipped Mueller. Mueller was the gold standard for FBI director during the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations. And he was absolutely relieved when Mueller was hired to continue the investigation that Trump wanted to quash, which was of the Russian interference in the 2016 election. It was obvious, it was agreed upon by the entire U.S. Intelligence Committee. And Mueller went about conducting this investigation for 2 years. And an awful lot of us in the media began to read into it things that weren't there. The central question became what was called collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. That probably never existed because the Russians were doing exactly what the Trump campaign wanted them to do. In any case, when it came out, Mueller allowed the Attorney General William Barr to frame the report as absolving Donald Trump from culpability on the issue of collusion and leaving the door open on the issue of obstruction of justice. Comey wanted a much more clear accounting from Mueller. He wanted a better PR effort from Mueller. And I think that was in part Mueller's fault, but I think it was the Democrats' fault as well. Because when Mueller finally went into the congressional hearing, the first question from Congressman Jerry Nadler should have been, are you saying in this report that the Russians actively tried to influence our election and actively tried to hack into our system? And Mueller would have said yes. And that should have been the headline. The Russians were invading us in cyberspace. But that never became the headline because, in part, the Democrats were looking for legalisms like obstruction of justice, and so was Mueller.
Does Comey write about William Barr and what he makes of him and of justice under him? Because all three of these guys, Robert Mueller, James Comey, and William Barr, were sort of establishment Republicans before this administration.
Well, he doesn't think very highly of Barr, that's for sure. He thinks that Barr created a dust storm to prevent the truth from coming out.
I have to ask about a couple of chapters in this book because, we were talking earlier about Comey's character and the fact that he's an observant Catholic. There is a chapter in here called Weird Sex and another chapter called Show. And I have to say, of all the things you would expect to see on the table of contents in a book by James Comey, those are not two chapter titles.
I actually forget what those two specific titles were about. But one thing you should know about Comey is that there is a slightly smarmy quality, an unctuousness to him, a desire to please, and a desire to sell books, obviously. Every chapter is headed by a quotation that could come out of whatever passes for Bartlett's familiar quotations these days. He quotes the Dalai Lama. He quotes Malcolm X. He quotes Virginia Woolf. And it seems that he's really, really trying to present himself as a credible, accessible member of the priesthood. which is a contradiction in itself.
You say in your review that the central question in the book is, can an institution religiously devoted to the truth, like the Justice Department, survive in a democracy where vast numbers of people believe that the 2020 election was a fraud? Now, you and I, to be fully transparent, are talking on the morning after the violent takeover of the Capitol by extremist Trump supporters. I want to ask what Comey's answer to that is. I'm also curious about what your answer is.
Comey's answer is that truth has to be the absolute basis for life in a democracy. And he's right. I agree with him. What we're facing now, and the reason why this book is not insignificant, even though it is repetitive, is the fact that we are facing a crisis of the truth in this country. We are facing a society where a majority of Republicans believe the election was stolen when there is no factual basis for that. And the major question that we have to face, and I don't know the answer, is how do we come together again? How do we get to the point where we agree on a common standard of truth? And I don't think that's going to happen overnight. I think that it is going to have an awful lot to do with the nature of the next president. I think that Biden is going to have to be who he's always been, which is someone who is decent and humble and willing to admit mistakes. And over time, that posture may affect his opponents. I think already the fact that we had this insurrection in the Capitol has affected the rhetoric of a lot of people on the right who were making the most extreme and dangerous sort of statements. I've always been a romantic about politics. I'm a romantic about this country. And I'd like to believe that we can get back to where we were. And I'd like to believe that the siege of the Capitol was the low point and that it was a reality check for the rest of society. I was watching Fox that night, Fox News, and they were using words like insurrection. They were saying that there was no evidence of fraud in the election. That's an important thing. And one hopes that we can move on from there.
All right, I have to ask one last question of you. As a romantic, as you just said yourself, about America and American politics, and also a satirist from Primary Colors, I guess how different is it to think about and write about the America right now compared with, that period back then, where at the time seemed like a moment of kind of polarization and scandal and shifting norms?
Well, it's no accident that Primary Colors was written in the 1990s when we saw the first burst of institutionalized extremism on the cable news networks and so on. One of the reasons why I wrote the book then was that I thought that the media culture had changed, and no one had ever written a book about the impact of television on politics. It was kind of remarkable, but no one had done it, and a novel. And Primary Colors was the first of those. But also, Primary Colors was misinterpreted by a lot of people. I'll tell you an anecdote. At the end of Clinton's presidency, I did several interviews with him for The New Yorker. And after the first one, Hillary came in and we were talking about health care. And Clinton turns to me and said, "Why'd you write that book anyway?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, I saw it as a tribute to larger than life politicians." At which point the First Lady snorted derisively. and I said, "But First Lady, would you rather have a larger than life president or a smaller than life president?" At that point, she was looking at the prospect of two people she didn't like at all, Al Gore or George W. Bush, be succeeding her husband. And so she shrugged in acknowledgement. And I said, larger than life politicians have larger than life strengths and larger than life weaknesses. Now, when I said that, I could never have imagined that the situation would devolve to the point where a sociopath became president of the United States, but that's where we've been. And I think that it's really important now for us to regain our faith in politicians and for politicians to earn it. The last book I wrote was called Charlie Mike, which is about this generation of veterans and how they're going to be different from veterans in the past because of their counterinsurgency training. They had to govern towns in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're bringing that sense of governance home. I've been an advisor to a bipartisan group of congressmen, Democrats and Republicans, all of whom are post 9/11 veterans who are trying to work together on the issues. We need more of that.
I'm going to end there. That's a very good way to end. Joe Klein is a political commentator, novelist, and author. And this week he reviews Saving Justice, Truth, Transparency, and Trust by James Comey. Elizabeth Egan joins us now. She is our group text columnist here to discuss her January pick, which is A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself by Peter Ho Davies. Liz, thanks for being here.
Hi, Pamela. Thanks for having me.
Let's dive right in. What is this novel about?
The novel begins with a couple, and the woman is pregnant, and these are the first two sentences. There was a chance the baby was normal. There was a chance the baby was not. And from there, we follow this couple through their rocky journey into parenthood. The first pregnancy that we watch them go through is terminated because the fetus has too many chromosomes and is diagnosed with something called mosaicism. And soon after, the woman is pregnant again and a baby is born. And we follow this small family from the time the son is born through his teenage years. And we watch the couple find their footing in parenthood and also watch the evolution of both their worry about their son, who they fear is on the autism spectrum, and also their decision whether or not to have him tested and how to accommodate his needs and quirks. And we also watch them find their footing with one another as co-parents. And also we watch their sense of humor blossoming and the way that they learn to go with the roller coaster ride of parenthood. I think what I found especially compelling about this book in this moment when we're all still kind of confined to our houses is that it was very reassuring to read about parental worry in a moment when we're all kind of flying blind. But that you also have this worry with a lot of funny lines and funny observations about parenthood.
Yeah, you have a line in your review where you say, if you've ever wondered if your family is normal, Davies' Stories offers a reassuring reality check. Now, not that I've ever wondered such a thing, but how so?
Just that, that sense when you're sitting in a restaurant with your family and you're looking at other families at other tables and you're thinking, you're doing that constant calculus of other people's kids seem to be participating in the conversation more. Other people's kids have better table manners. And other couples aren't, whispering like complaints about one another under their breath. This book is kind of a macrocosm and a microcosm of that dynamic. It is just a really powerful and also, I want to emphasize, quite funny reminder that there is no such thing as normal. It makes you rethink the entire idea of normal. And I don't want to give any spoilers about how the boy that they're raising turns out, but I will say that they sort of learn to go with him and go with his various interests and obsessions, and they learn to have fun with him. And that's something that I think is one of the great joys of parenthood when you learn how to do that.
I mean, it is interesting, as you say, to think about this subject during this time where everyone is confined because you don't have those sitting in the diner moments looking across at other families.
No, you don't. And I also think we're in such uncharted territory right now. Nobody knows how much time their kids should be glued to screens every day. Nobody knows how much they should push their kids to do something they don't want to do. Everything is out the window. The rules do not apply right now.
And I mean, frankly, too, like if you are a parent of a child and wondering, like, is this normal? Is this not? Is there something medical or psychological or, developmental going on here? It's a really very difficult time to find that out.
It is. And also you don't have your usual, what I think of as my kitchen cabinet of friends, mothers and fathers who are going through the same things at the same time. I mean, certainly I'm texting and I'm calling and occasionally taking walks with people, but I'm no longer in a room with a large group of fellow parents going through the same things that I'm going through at the same time. And Peter Ho Davies' voice was like a voice in the wilderness, reminding me that those conversations have happened always, even before the pandemic. They will happen again. None of us are alone. And he just had such an honest approach. I kept thinking, this is the guy that if you arrive at the holiday concert at your kid's school 20 minutes early, this is the stranger you hope you sit next to in the auditorium and make small talk with, because you will find him wildly entertaining.
Now, we're talking about the author, Peter Ho Davies, and not the narrator, right? But let's talk about who the narrator is.
Yes, that is a very important distinction. It is very hard not to read this book as a memoir. Actually, the narrator is a writing teacher. He's a former physicist turned writer. And there's a lot of kind of coyness in his consideration of what is fiction and what's not fiction in his teaching of his own students. In fact, the wife in this book is an editor. And at the very beginning of the book, she asks her husband if he's going to write about what they're going through. And he says he doesn't know how to make a story of it. So you do wonder if there's a bit of an autobiographical element. It doesn't really matter. But the narrator himself is just incredibly, I hesitate to say relatable, because I think that's a word that's overused, but he's incredibly entertaining, incredibly honest, and also unexpectedly wise. I don't think that he sets out to tell you this story with wisdom as a primary goal, but I felt that he was. And there's also, actually, speaking of his teaching, there's a great quote in the book that says, if he ever did write the story, he thought, there was a chance that it would be true, a chance that it would not. A story, at least, could be both. So while we have a kind of a story that has a lot of steam and propels you forward, there's also kind of this meditation on fiction versus nonfiction that I enjoyed.
The book deals with issues like abortion and pregnancy and parenthood, all from the father's perspective. And you read a lot of books that deal with family. How unusual is it to get from the father's perspective, and how well do you think Peter Ho Davies does it? Does he do it differently from, I don't know, the many other or the very few other books that do that?
I've definitely never in my entire reading career read about abortion from the perspective of the father or a man's perspective. I found it really interesting. And at first, I bristled a little bit. I thought, this is an experience that belongs to the woman. But in the case of this couple, of course, it doesn't just belong to the woman. And it's the father's struggle after the procedure. It goes on for a long time. He ends up becoming an escort at an abortion clinic and befriends a fellow volunteer and ends up learning a lot from her. At first, I thought it was a strange turn for the book to take, but again, I went with it and found it really enlightening. He's just really thoughtful, and it was refreshing to hear from a man. And also the deep love that a father has for a child. Of course, we've read that in many books, but I enjoy hearing about family from all perspectives, not just a woman's perspective.
Listeners may have noticed that we haven't named any names, and that's for a reason. Like, these are nameless characters. I just want to go on a little tangent. Well, first of all, I guess before we do, why do you think Peter Ho Davies decides to do that?
Actually, I think this son's name is mentioned once in the entire book. But at first I thought he was going with kind of a Shel Silverstein vibe. I kept thinking of The Giving Tree, where it's the boy, the tree, you never learn the names. It gives it a universal quality. This could be anybody that you're reading about. I said in my review, it could even be you. And I liked that. And as you know, Pamela, I'm a person who loves names. So it's a little disorienting to me to read an entire novel where there there are no names. In this case, it works. It doesn't matter.
What got you to pick this book up? Because you get so many books and books to consider specifically for this column. What made you think it would be a good book for discussion?
I am a magnet to family stories. I was definitely attracted to the idea of reading about new parenthood from a father's perspective. And as soon as I realized that this look at parenthood didn't end when the child started kindergarten, I knew I wanted to write about it. Because one of my pet peeves about all the books I read about parenthood, not all of them, but many of them, and
They end when the child is one.
Yes, all the memoirs end when the child is at an age where the parent no longer feels comfortable revealing personal details about them. And I have written about my own kids extensively, and I am right on board with that. I understand from the perspective of a writer, you run into an ethical quandary. But I loved that this book gave us this intimate look at the boy when he's very young, but also follows him as he grows older. And I love reading about big kids, not just little kids. I find them way more interesting. And the honesty there, I think, is what drew me in. I also loved the idea, I loved the slow dawning on the narrator that what he thinks of as the biggest choice, whether or not to have a child, actually only leads to bigger choices. You know, there's that expression, little kids, little problems, and how the worries and the choices you make and the things that keep you up late at night, they get bigger and bigger. And Peter Ho Davies finds a way of balancing those big things that keep you up at night with these really funny observations, things that the narrator's boy says, and just little snarky asides that the husband and wife say to each other, which that balance was really nice.
You know, it's interesting. You make always in this column a couple of suggestions of sort of comparable books, like if you liked this or if you want further reading. And in this case, you named two books, both of which I think actually end where the child is also really young, right? One book
Yes.
was Elizabeth McCracken's An Exact Replica of a Figment of My Imagination, and the other was A Life's Work by Rachel Cusk.
Yes, A Life's Work by Rachel Cusk is a memoir of a mother having a small child. I think it really only covers the infancy. And actually, An Exact Replica of a Figment of My Imagination follows the journey of a woman as she grapples with the aftermath of a stillbirth. And it sounds unbearably sad to the point of being unreadable, but it's not. It's a beautiful book. I don't want to give anything away, but I believe you know right from the beginning that another baby is born not long after. What both of those books have in common with A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself is just kind of cracking open these subjects that we don't always read about and being incredibly honest about them.
You interview the author on Instagram for group text. What question are you most dying to ask Peter Ho Davies about this book?
I'll tread carefully on this, but I'm curious about how he balanced autobiography and fiction. I'm curious about what pieces of his own experiences with fatherhood he wove into this book, while being aware that that's kind of an offensive question. A novelist should be able to present a story and not be grilled about how much of it is true. But I'm curious about that in a polite way. And I'm also curious about the feedback he will have got. By the time I speak to him, the book will have been in the world for a couple of weeks. And I'm curious about what the response will be, because I found the honesty about the abortion and the fathers grappling with it very refreshing, as I said. But I'm curious if there will be people who put it down after that.
For listeners who are interested in checking out that conversation, when will that be?
Right now, our Instagram Live is scheduled for Friday, January 22nd at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. And it will be from the New York Times Books account. And Peter Ho Davies will be coming in from his publisher's account. He's published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And there will be an Instagram post about the book where we ask people to leave questions. And I will also obviously come with questions of my own.
So for listeners who want to hear more about this book, to hear directly from the author and to hear Liz's conversation with him, you can go to @NYTBooks on Instagram. And until then, Liz, thanks so much for being here.
Pamela, thank you for having me.
Elizabeth Egan is an editor at the New York Times Book Review. She is also our group text columnist. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new?
So, as we're coming to the end of the Trump administration, we've talked many times on this podcast about how the Trump era has shaped publishing and really been an incredible financial boon for publishers. There have been so many huge hits and news-breaking books that have come out of reporting on the Trump administration. And there's this question at the end of his presidency of how long the appetite for books about Trump might persist and what it means for publishers. It's been an extraordinary era in many ways, and particularly, historically and politically, but also financially for, media outlets and for publishing companies. So what we've seen in the last few weeks in the run-up to the election and in the aftermath was a huge flurry of book deals about the president, his administration, from prominent journalists, including several of our own colleagues. And, while this is pretty typical when there is a change in administration, you often see books coming out that are kind of looking back on what the administration meant for the country. I think in many ways, this is an extraordinary moment. And I think we will see more blockbuster books coming out of this era. I mean, you can imagine an entire book written, for example, looking at the events in the Capitol. There are books in the works by the Washington Post reporters Philip Rucker and Carol Leonnig, who are going to look at the last year of Trump's presidency when so much has happened. So I think we will see more successes coming out of this, and it's probably going to take years for authors and historians to unravel everything that has happened in the last 4 years. At the same time, we're probably going to see a surge in books by conservatives, because it's often the case that the party that is out of power has a platform on TV or through books, and they have a pretty eager audience of people who want to be spoken to and reassured when their leaders are out of power. So it's very likely that we'll see a lot of books from conservatives, from Republicans saying, how does the party come together after this? Or who are our next leaders? That's pretty typical. But again, like so many things in this period, there's extraordinary challenges for publishers. We've already seen a little bit of discomfort with publishing books by conservatives. We saw that one Republican senator, Josh Hawley, had his book deal canceled after the attack on the Capitol last week. And his publisher, or his former publisher, I should say, Simon & Schuster, cited his effort to question the results of the election and said that given the environment in the country right now and the partisan rancor, they couldn't in good conscience, release a book by him. So there's a question of how delicate this is.
Do you think it's going to be harder for writers who have unpopular views or controversial views to get their work published by the Big Five? I asked specifically because in both the case of Senator Josh Hawley and the most recent case before that, Woody Allen, which was going to be published by Hachette originally, there was a kind of groundswell among other authors published by that imprint or that house that said, hey, we don't want to do business with you if you're going to publish this book.
Yeah, I do think that is something that has gotten more pronounced recently, and it's likely to continue. I think the question when it comes to political books is how much it filters down to their conservative imprints. So, most of the Big Five have dedicated imprints for conservative books. There's Center Street at Hachette and other examples. And they've sort of siloed off conservative authors, but in some cases, authors don't make those distinctions when they're saying, I don't want to work with a company that's publishing author X with these views. And so I think that is a question. Of course, in the case of Woody Allen, he did find a publisher, Skyhorse. I'm sure that Senator Josh Hawley could find an independent conservative publisher. So we might see more authors going to independent houses like Regnery or others that have sort of a reputation for publishing conservative voices and don't face the pressures that these big kind of international companies face when it comes to potential employee boycotts, like we saw with Woody Allen, or authors that work with the company raising their objections and possibly taking their work elsewhere. But it is an interesting question. I think it's going to be difficult for publishers, I think, to work with authors who have particularly strong partisan views when it comes to this past election. Like, I can see it being a challenge to publish somebody who was questioning the results of the election, given the violence that we've seen and the degree of division in the country. It's going to be more delicate than it has been in previous moments in the country when there's been a change of administration.
Last week's attempt to overtake the Capitol by a Trump-supporting mob is the kind of big news event that usually, like, in the immediate aftermath, you see book deals. That hasn't quite happened yet, right? We haven't seen anyone sign a deal to give a TikTok of that.
I will expect one very soon. I mean, I haven't seen one, but I'm sure conversations are happening. And I agree. I think it's one of those moments in history that is going to be unpacked by authors and historians and journalists. And I expect more than one book deal probably looking at what exactly happened that day, what the impact will be going forward, and what led up to it. So yeah, I'm sure that's going to factor into the books that have already been signed for people that are writing about the end of the Trump administration. And I expect there'll be additional book deals just examining and unpacking that extraordinary day.
Next week, Alexandra, I bet you'll have news.
Maybe I'll have some more news next
All right.
week.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about the latest in literary criticism are critics Parul Sehgal and Jennifer Szalai. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
We are speaking during interesting times. People may want to think about other things than what is going on in our nation's capital. But I'm going to start with you, Jen, because you actually review a book about our nation's capital. Tell us about it.
Yes. So the book I reviewed is called Kill Switch by Adam Gentleson. And I guess I should also say the subtitle because it's pretty evocative. It's called The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. You know, it should be said that Gentleson has a very distinct point of view, which I think is revealed in that subtitle. He himself, for a number of years, worked as a senior aide to Democratic Senator Harry Reid, who, until 2015, was the Senate Majority Leader. Gentelson's overarching argument in the book is that the Senate, which was, I guess, originally conceived as a place that could act as, you know, as the cliche goes, a cooling saucer for whatever was put to the Senate by the House, that in fact, it's turned into what he calls a kill switch, that it's a place where any ambitious legislation, if there's a determined core of senators who want to obstruct it, they can do it. Obviously, they don't need to be in the majority. You just have to have a core number of people who want to essentially use the filibuster to stop a bill. And so, you know, he traces the history. The first half of the book really goes through the history of the Senate, how it came to be, you know, how it came to be an institution that, you know, since 2000, the way it's been structured is that because there are 2 senators for each state, regardless of the population, in fact, even when Republicans in the last 2 decades have held a majority of seats. So there's been a majority of Republican senators. They've only ever represented a minority of the population. So Gentleson wants to look at the rise of this institution. He looks at the history. He also looks at what transpired in the last decade. And one of the things he does focus on, obviously, because of his own insider role in it, is the decision by Harry Reid to, quote unquote, go nuclear in 2013 and to end the filibuster for White House nominees, which was considered at the time such a disruption of norms. And a number of people were outraged. And what Gentleson says is that Harry Reid had to do it because at the time, There was a determined core of obstructionists. He says that they weren't allowing President Obama to actually legislate, to actually choose his nominees. So while I was reading the book, it was before the runoffs in Georgia, which took place on January 5th. And now, as we know, the Democrats will have the majority in the Senate. And one of the suggestions of Jentelson's book is that even if that's the case, because it's a majority of one, essentially, with Kamala Harris's vote, they'll have 51, that what that means is that there are still a number of changes that will have to take place if there's going to be any real legislation that happens. And so one of the, I thought, fascinating things that he goes into is how all these sort of arcane Senate rules work, which sounds really granular and maybe wonkish, but actually he shows very clearly how they've been used, weaponized, streamlined to the point where it's actually very much worth paying attention to how these rules work, because you see how attempts to actually reform the filibuster over the years, to actually limit its power, because those reforms themselves were flawed, they actually made the situation worse. So I had heard about silent filibusters before, but I didn't necessarily really understand how they work. But he shows how, you don't even necessarily have to give a speech. Like, you don't have to filibuster in the old sense of the word. You can actually just call up somebody in the cloakroom and say, I intend to filibuster this, and that's registered. And then the move to overcome a filibuster requires a supermajority, and so that essentially ups the threshold for passing legislation. And it's really just fascinating to look at it. And he at the end, he comes to a number of suggestions for reform. So
you don't have to be like up there at a lectern reading for the joy of cooking and that kind of thing.
No. And part of the reason that's no longer the case is because the modern Senate has become so efficient that it deals with so many pieces of legislation that they have different tracks of things going on, so they can just keep tabling legislation if there's resistance to it. So it's really fascinating to read this book. And I think even people who don't necessarily share Jentelson's politics will learn from it. And one of the things that I did say in the review is that I actually don't think that somebody like Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, that he would necessarily disagree with the facts that Jentelson is putting forward in this book. It just seems to me that the attitude would just be like, okay, well, that's how it works, and so we use it, People have to deal with it.
I'm wondering if you thought back while you were reading this book to what Obama wrote in his book about the filibuster.
What was fascinating when you read Obama's book, when you read about politics in the last decade, is to look at the treatment that Obama specifically received from Mitch McConnell in the Senate. And I think the way that Republicans have presented it is that that was just politics as usual. Obviously, the opposition party is going to resist what the president, if the president is from another party, wants to do. But one of the things that Jentelson points out, and I don't think I'd seen the statistic presented in these stark terms, he says, all other presidents combined had endured a total of 82 filibusters against their nominees. But from 2009 to 2013, President Obama alone faced 86. So previous presidents, all of them combined, 82 filibusters against their nominees. And then Obama, in those 4 years alone, faced 86. So that is part of Jentelson's reasoning when he goes to explain why Harry Reid did what he did.
All right, we are speaking on January 7th. I think it's important context given the fact that yesterday a group of extreme pro-Trump supporters mobbed and overtook the U.S. Capitol. And I'm wondering, Jen, you just read this book. Is there anything that you, in this context, have to say about the contents of the book at this moment?
I mean, I don't know if spectacular is the word to describe what we saw yesterday. I mean, I think, the images were just overwhelming, but there was something very flagrant, theatrical about it. And I think what this book shows is that there's also some other stuff that happens in government that happens quietly that happens in a way that a lot of people don't necessarily pay attention to because it has to do with endless Senate procedure and rules that actually have a huge effect on people's lives in terms of whether or not legislation gets passed. It's important, obviously, to pay attention to what's going on because that is essential, but it's also important, I think, to sort of understand the underlying currents of what's happening. And I think books like Jentelson's book that really go into the history, the details, the way that these things work in actual fact, and the way that people use power, not just the overt power displays that we see on television all the time, but the way that politics works in DC. I think a book like this is very useful.
Okay, here is a whiplash-inducing segue over to Parul. But Parul, the book that you write about this week in an essay also comes off of news. As of January 1st, a number of major classic American novels, the copyright expired and they've gone into the public domain. And one of those books is The Great Gatsby. You have something to say about that book.
Yeah, I reviewed a promising new book called The Great Gatsby. I have great hopes for its future and success. Yeah, so I wrote about The Great Gatsby, a little bit about the copyright expiring, and just sort of, the glut of Gatsbyana that we seem to have been drowning in even before the copyright expired in film and in music. And it's just a story that seems to have sunk in very deeply in the imagination. I was going to say the American imagination, but there's actually a really bad Bollywood movie based on The Great Gatsby, which I do not recommend.
Oh, but come on. So for those who do want to check it out, what is it called?
No. Come on. My integrity is on the line. So I wrote about all of this sort of happening. And I mean, there are two new editions of Gatsby that are also out this month with introductions by novelists and by critics. And so I wanted to sort of think a little bit about The Great Gatsby, because one of the things that interests me about this book is that it is so canonized, it is taught, it is endlessly discussed, and yet it's a very kind of unstable text. Like, what we think this book about has changed a lot since it was first published, and there's also a really roiling debate about, is the book any good? And that's something that's very, very interesting to me because, we have conversations about, should Huck Finn be taught in school, etc. How can these books be updated? How can they be framed? But we don't really look at a book like Moby Dick or Huck Finn and say, like, is the writing good? Can these writers actually tell a story? And yet with Gatsby, you see this from the moment it was published. Fitzgerald was very, very confident about the book. He was very proud of it. He said, this is, the finest American novel. This is the best picture of youth, etc. But from the beginning, the reviews went one of two ways. People either were in raptures about it, people like T.S. Eliot, and then there were other people like Leslie Fiedler who said things like, this is the product of a second-rate mind. And so I wanted to trace some of those opinions to sort of dig into it a little bit. And I don't know, finally end up on this point that there is something really, at least for me, deeply special and important about a book that can sustain so many interpretations, provoke so many interpretations, so many editions, so many versions. There's something very fertile about it. There's something very generative about these characters and about the situation.
All right, I have a couple of very basic questions for you. One is a little bit more about what you think. But before we get there, for those who did not get this book assigned to them in junior high, and they're actually, I think it has fallen a little bit off of the curriculum in many schools. What is this book about?
This book is about a young man named Nick who moves east, and he's going to work in finance, and he takes a little house in Long Island next to this big grotesque mansion that is owned by the very mysterious Mr. Gatsby, Jay Gatsby, who it turns out is in love with Nick's cousin Daisy. And Gatsby sort of constructed this life as this lure to sort of attract Daisy, who was this rich, inaccessible girl, and he was, a poor soldier when they first met and fell in love. And now, of course, she's married to this grotesque guy named Tom, and so the book sort of goes from there. It's a book about the multiple affairs that are going on. It's about Nick's disgust with these people that he's spending time with his sort of horror of their sort of moral vacuity. And I mean, I guess I shouldn't be worried about spoiling it, but maybe should I? I mean, in the review I wasn't, but I think that's enough to sort of say that he sort of spends time with them and he sort of it becomes a book, as people are talking about a lot these days, about the carelessness of the rich, how they smash things up, they hurt people, and they can walk away with their hands quite clean. And the book is written, as we understand, it's actually written by Nick a few years after. And he's sort of, as I put it in the review, it's a frenzy of disgust. And I think when I went back and I read it, that's what I felt very differently this time. And I've read the book, over the years in many different contexts, in many different ways. But I think when I read it this time, I was struck by two things. One is that he's really writing to indict Nick. He's really, really writing to sort of indict Daisy and her husband for what they've done. And the second thing that really struck me that I don't think it's talked about very much is that it's, as Fitzgerald said, it's a book about youth. And it was a book written by a 28-year-old. And it's really written about a very, very specific kind of loneliness. Like, I was struck in the beginning when you're reading the book that there's this whole sequence when Nick first moves to the house next to Gatsby's where his dog runs away. Nobody ever talks about what is that doing in this book? Why should we know this? And then he's lonely because his landlady speaks Finnish. And you're getting a sense of somebody who is really, really unmoored and stuck in a sense with these people. One of the criticisms that Gatsby gets is sort of, why should we pay attention to these characters that are painted as caricatures? They're not given a lot of humanity in a lot of ways. And I think when I read it, really reading for Nick's own loneliness, which is shown to us, which is underscored for us. He's forced into this sort of society and remembering what it's like to be young and to be stuck in a certain way and paralyzed in a certain way and just being put. I think it's a great book for high school, in that way. You're just sort of, you have to make do a little bit with the people that you're around. And it's not always a choice. And I think that was some of these sort of interesting new reads I had when I came to the book.
Did you read it in high school? Was it assigned to you?
Yeah, I think I read it before it was assigned. I read it first in middle school and then read it in high school with a great teacher, and it was sort of like one of those books that, as many people point out, like the symbolism is very heavy, there's a lot of glasses, there's a lot of, the way that the color works. It's all, and Fitzgerald himself was very influenced by The Wasteland and by a certain kind of thunderous symbolism. So it's a good book to sort of learn how to interpret and to look at imagery and stuff like that. But I had a great teacher who taught it to me. And then, I think I always would go back and read it every now and again, just because, when it's been a long time, sometimes I just remember the effect of Gatsby. You remember the sort of something very diaphanous, right? You remember a certain mood that's in the book. And I would go back to say, or to wonder, like, how was that done? What happened? And then you read it and it's a very different thing entirely. But what lingers in the mind after you read a book is its own thing. It's like a certain kind of perfume is left after that book. But then you go and you read it and it's much more complicated and it's much angrier than I always remember.
You ask in your essay this question, is it a good novel or a great novel? What do you think?
What do I think? I think I really like those questions. And I think I do.
This question is for other people.
No, but for me, yeah. And I think I do say, and I say it in the review, I think it is great, but I don't think it's great for the reasons some people do. I don't think it has that certain cut gem perfection. When I went back and I read it and I felt how loose it is. I feel like, some of the reasons people criticize this book because, you can't pin Nick down on, why is he ambivalent about the rich, but he's spending time with them? And what about the sort of shallowness at the center of it? I think those are really interesting things. I think they're interesting effects. And I don't think Fitzgerald is totally in control of them in the book, which I find very interesting. And I don't think he was in control of them in his life. He was somebody, as I write in the review, he hated the rich. He loathed them. And all he wanted to do was spend time with them and write about them. All he wanted to do was to marry Zelda, this expensive girl, this girl he'd worked so hard to actually afford, and at the same time having such contempt for the callousness and superficiality. And I think that the book is a beautiful extension of the ways that he himself was torn and complicated.
I love that idea, that question of whether like an author is in control of their own book, of their characters.
Yeah, or whether like that's something you should really privilege, like in writing classes, like that's a big thing. They'll tell you it feels like this is not intentional in the book. But I think books are written as much as they're secreted. All kinds of things happen that the writer themselves is not fully aware of. And maybe I say that because it makes the critic more important in this equation. Like, you need me to come along. I don't know if that's true, but I like that in a proper novel, in a novel that's big enough and wants to do, and explore all kinds of things, you're going to run into stuff that is unintentional and awkward and wobbly. And I find all of that very, very endlessly endearing and interesting.
Well, it's been actually probably a couple of decades since I read it. And I read it as an adult. And, because I was growing up in Canada, I was never assigned the book in school. And so from what I remember when reading it, I thought it was kind of fascinating just because there was something about it that to me, if I'm going to try to pin it down, which I realize is hard to do with this book in many ways, but there was something about it that just seems so American to me, because before coming to it, I had read about it, I had heard about it, I had a very vague, hazy sense of what it was, and then to actually get into it, and I think, Parul, what I really loved about your essay is that you capture the sort of ambivalence and mess of the novel in a way that I think struck me at the time. But at the same time, it's also interesting to me, you've talked about reading it, going back to it periodically ever since, and because for me, I haven't read it since I was like 20. I wonder what would strike me now, because I do feel like it's also interesting to think about it as like a young person's book, as the experience of youth, the experience of being alone, and how I would see it now at a very different point in my life.
I love the point you make about it being American. And like, this is one of those pieces where, you just wish you had more space, because one of the interesting things about Gatsby is when you go and you read his letters to Max Perkins or anybody else is that he was very consciously thinking about, he and Hemingway were thinking about, what should an American novel be about? What should it sound like? It still felt young in that way. It still felt like something new. And I think that there's so much in this book that is deliberately, aggressively positioning itself as an American novel. There's so much language about the settlers and the frontier and, staking this out. And I think that there's there's so much more to say. And I'm sure other writers have, but that's one thing I regretted not being able to bring into the piece. Pamela, what about you?
I read it even longer ago than Jen, so I want to start with that caveat. My dad had recommended This Side of Paradise, and so I remember reading that first and hating it. And so I went in with like deeply prejudiced against The Great Gatsby, and I didn't like it when I read it. Well, these are now junior high school opinions, so I really want to add a major caveat. At the time, I found it pretentious and off-putting. There was something about the style that I didn't like. And then again, in a very junior high school way, I think I had some idea at that time that you either liked Fitzgerald or you liked Hemingway. And I decided that I liked Hemingway. So again, these are like really 12-year-old, 13-year-old opinions.
I'm into them. I think
I don't know.
I would read this.
And then there's this other layer, which is that I grew up not in the posh area of this town, but I grew up in what is East Egg in the novel. And I worked for a time in high school in West Egg. And everyone who lived in that area of Long Island, which is in reality Great Neck and Cow's Neck or Port Washington, and specifically the Sands Point neighborhood of Port Washington or village of Port Washington, which is a group of incorporated villages. I was not in that village, was aware that, we were living in Great Gatsby territory. And so it sort of felt like, I don't know, in your backyard, but not about us. So I probably need to reread it. Your essay certainly made me want to reread it.
Good, and then we can argue about it, which is the great pleasure of the book.
All right. To be continued. Okay, Parul, Jen, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.